What's up, YouTube? Nobody asked, but I figured I'd make a video on how to make all of these different types of cutting boards, all the way from the easiest to intermediate and a little bit more advanced one. So hopefully you enjoy the video. I'll try and leave some timestamps down below for each build, and then stick around to the end and I'll go over the pros and cons of each different type of board. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're gonna be making 3 different kinds of boards, and it's all kind of based on the grain orientation of the boards. So let's say you've got a board here. The top and the bottom, that's gonna be your face grain. These sides here is your edge grain, and then the end here is end grain. The first board we're gonna be making is a face grain board. You could just even take a board just like this, as long as it's thick enough. You don't really want it super thin, but you could take this, cut it down to the dimensions that you want, sand it down and finish it, and then bam, you've got a cutting board. That's the super simple way of doing it. I'm gonna do something a little bit different just to kind of get a cool look. I've got this old little slice of an ash tree that died a couple years back in our yard, and I'll show you the grain on here, and the knots and everything just kind of has a cool look. And that's one of the benefits of a face grain board. You can get some cool looking wood. So yeah, let's get into it. Now this wood is not super flat. It's got a little bit of a twist to it. So I've got this sheet of plywood that is roughly the width of my planer here. So we're gonna stabilize this with some shims and a little bit of hot glue so that it can pass through the planer and we can get a nice flat surface on top here to work with. We're gonna do that real quick and then run it through the planer and take a little bit of thickness off. Now, in theory, we should have a flat board. We just gotta pop it off of this sheet of plywood. Then we have a flat reference side that we can run through the planer and get it to the final thickness and get the other side flat. Okay, now that we got the board relatively flat, I'm gonna try and pick out the shape that I want the cutting board to be, but I want to keep some of this cool natural edge and the knot and everything in there. So I'm just gonna kind of toy around with a couple shapes and see what I think looks good. My bandsaw is out of commission at the moment, so I'm gonna be using just a good old jigsaw to cut out this shape. Okay, now we've got the rough shape of our board here. Next step is going to be to clean up all this sapwood and bark that's still on here. Kind of smooth everything out, sand it down, get it to the final shape. Okay, now that we got our board sanded up to 120 grit, what we're gonna do next is called a water pop. And what that essentially is just spritzing water to cover the whole board, and that will make the grain pop a little bit so that we can then do our final finish sand. So we'll do that. We'll do it on all of our boards, and then we'll apply some finish and it'll be done. All right, our second cutting board is going to be an edge grain cutting board, which basically means we're going to take a board, cut it into strips, flip them all on their sides so that the edge grain is facing up, and then glue them all together in whatever pattern we think looks good. So I'm going to cut some of this wood to the rough length that we want. Then we're going to rip it down to our width, and then we'll get going on the glue up. Okay, so since we got all of our boards ripped to the width that we want on the table saw, and the width of the board that we're ripping is going to be the thickness of the board itself, I ripped mine about a little over 1.5 inches wide, and that's so that once I'm done with this glue up and everything, I can plane it down and lose a little bit of the thickness to be about 1.5 inches thick. We're going to turn all of these up to where the edge grain is facing up. This is the pattern that I came up with. I've got some cherry in here, and then a couple strips of walnut and a maple strip in the middle there. Let's go ahead and glue this up. And for anybody wondering, I use Titebond 3 for cutting board glue ups. It's waterproof, it's food safe, it's great glue for them. Okay, the glue's set up, so we're gonna take it out of the clamps, clean up some of the glue, squeeze out, and then we're gonna run it through the planer to get it all flattened and ready for finish. Okay, we got it planed down to the thickness that we want. Now we just need to cut it to the dimensions that we want. This board's going to be around 10 inches by 19 inches, give or take. So we'll get it cut up and then we'll work on getting it finished. So our third and final board is going to be an end grain cutting board. Now, I just milled up all these pieces. I've got some cherry and some eucalyptus in here. And I'll try and get some shots of the end grain so you can see what I'm going for in terms of a pattern. The eucalyptus here has some sapwood and some heartwood in there. The sapwood is this gray, brownish, kind of the lighter color. The heartwood is that reddish brown color. And when you join those together, you can make some pretty cool patterns out of them. So we'll go ahead and get this all glued up and then come back, mill it up, get it sliced up and do another glue up. And that's when you really kind of see the pattern that we're going for come together. Now I'm gluing this up in two different sections. These two won't get glued together. This is just gonna be a block of some cherry, and then this is gonna be our cherry and eucalyptus with our, what's gonna be our diamond shapes. And then I'm gonna have some strips of this cherry just to sort of mix and match in there with the rest of it. All right, it's all glued up. We're gonna go ahead and pull these out, get them milled up, and then get our slices cut for the next glue up. Okay, so the diamond pattern I'm going for is gonna be like this. You can kind of see that diamond shape with the sapwood. You could do a handful of different kinds of patterns. You could even do the opposite and do like an X pattern. There's a bunch of different ways you can go about it. But I'm gonna do diamond pattern with a little bit of this cherry in between. Now that we've got the pattern figured out that we want, I'm gonna actually take this inside to do a glue up because it's a little, the temperature dropped here and it's a little cold to do a glue up out here in the shop. And then we'll come back after the glue has a few hours to set up and we'll mill it down flat and get it finished. All right, I'm gonna take this inside and let it set up and then we'll come back out. All right, she's all glued up. We're gonna take it out of the clamps and get it cleaned up. Now, because this is end grain, we can't run it through the planer like we would with our other boards. Basically, it's just not super safe. You're gonna get a lot of tear out on the wood, and in some cases, you can have the whole thing explode in the planer on you. So I'm gonna use a router sled to flatten both sides of it, and then we'll get to sanding, a lot of sanding. Now, my router sled is pretty rudimentary. Don't judge me. Something I made a long time ago, but it works. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Let's get it flattened. Now, since we have this one side flattened and it's secured in here right now, I'm gonna go ahead and do a rough sand on this side to get it really flat. Okay, well, after about an hour and a half of sanding, it's all right. Still got to do a finish sand on it, but now we get to flip it over and do the exact same thing on the other side. But I'll spare you the footage of that. We'll come back when we're ready to cut it up and make it an actual rectangle. So yeah, I'm gonna do a whole bunch more sanding and we'll come back and cut it up. All right, so the epoxy is cured overnight. So we're gonna come back, do a little more sanding, do a water pop, and then the finish sand, and then we'll do our mineral oil bath and our board conditioner, then should be good to go. Real quick before we go over all these boards, I just wanted to say if you've enjoyed the video so far, it would be awesome if you could leave a like, comment, subscribe, all the fun things. I'd like to make a lot more videos. If you have any ideas for future videos, comment down below. I like a good challenge. All right, let's go over some pros and cons of each. For the first one, this face grain board, they're super easy to make. If you've got a jigsaw or any kind of saw really, and some sandpaper, you can make one. Another pro is that you can get some really cool figured wood with knots, different grain patterns, everything that you wouldn't be able to get necessarily with these other kinds of boards. Now, one of the major cons of this is it doesn't stand up to a lot of abuse from a knife. So if you're actually cutting on this, you're gonna get knife marks all over it. It's not super hard, which is why I made this one more in the style of like a charcuterie board or a serving board, because I wouldn't be cutting on this a bunch. Also, over time, these will tend to warp. They'll cup or twist a little bit, just as the wood expands and contracts. That's just what wood does. So after a little bit of time, these boards will get a little bit wonky. They won't really be flat anymore. It just happens. The thicker you can go with it, the better. If you get super thin, it'll get really bad. But they're still really cool and super easy to make. Okay, the second board, edge grain board. Some of the pros and cons of this one, it's also pretty easy to make. If you've got a table saw and some clamps, you can make these all day. It is a little bit more resilient to knife marks than the face grain board. Not a ton, but a little bit. Also with this board, because it's multiple boards glued up, you're not gonna have the same issue with cupping and twisting like you would with this face grain board. You can also make some pretty cool patterns with it, depending on the type of wood that you use and where you place that wood. You're kind of stuck with linear patterns just because that's the way that they're built. But all in all, this is a good board. And lastly, our third board, the Ingrain board. There's a handful of pros and cons to this one as well. It obviously takes a lot longer to build this one than it does either of these two. You have multiple glue ups and there's a little bit more involved in planning. But you can make all sorts of patterns with this depending on how many glue ups you want to do, the different types of wood you use. There's really infinite number of patterns that you can make out of these. One of the best things about Ingrain is that it's really hard. So it's gonna stand up to your knife or anything that you're using on it. But that also means because it's really hard, you are gonna sand a lot. And I mean a lot. There are multiple hours of sanding in on this board. You also shouldn't run into any serious issues with cupping or twisting on this type of board either. This one will definitely stand up to the most abuse and last the longest. So total, I've got about maybe 2 hours of labor into this board, around 2 to 3 hours on this one, and then probably 5 to 6 hours on this one. So if you're looking for something quick and easy, face grain board is the way to go. If you want a challenge, go for the Ingrain. And if you just want to go middle of the road, go for the edge grain. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope it convinced you to get out there and try and make something.